All right. With that, I'm excited to introduce our first speakers. Lars Eriksson is the Senior Vice President of Public Affairs and Communications at the Seattle Metro Chamber. Lars joined the Chamber with 25 years of experience in public and government relations, communications, and politics, most recently serving as Senior Director of External Relations for WatchDOT. Welcome, Lars. And joining Lars and the rest of us is Stephanie Formas, Vice President at Challenge Seattle, an alliance of CEOs from 22 of the region's largest employers, including proudly Expedia Group. Stephanie brings experience in public relations, business, corporate communications, and government. Lars, take it away.
Thank you, Richard, and I really appreciate everybody joining us today. I'm going to be talking about the return to office survey that the Chamber sent out to our members in early April, and give you the highlights on what we discovered our members are doing, what they're experiencing, and then hand it off to Stephanie. So we decided to do the survey. Our colleagues at the city's Office of Economic Development that are really engaging with Mayor Harrell's effort around activating downtown asked us to reach out to our members and see how they're managing return to office, what the consensus is amongst our members. But also, this was a back and forth discussion with the mayor's office on reminding them that they really need to come and talk to our members and engage and find out what hurdles they're experiencing and what they're wanting to do to get folks back in and help reinvigorate downtown. So we did this survey in April. We sent it out to all 2,500 of our members, and we had responses from 221. And that may seem like a small number, but I think for those of you that work in email marketing space, it's actually a pretty good response, and we're pretty pleased. Our goal was to get at least 125. So, to get this number is pretty helpful. You'll see in the location that they're spread out, and because many businesses in the region have multiple locations, that's why you're not going to see a total of 100% there. We had a great representation from downtown Seattle. Obviously, many of the businesses that participated in the survey have some kind of presence in the city outside of the downtown and across the region. We also wanted to see what other regional downtowns were experiencing. However, the number is pretty low. Great diversity in types of industries that we got responses from. You'll see again from financial services, transportation, arts and culture, government, and across the spectrum from nonprofit to public sector, and obviously with some of our major employers as well. Business size, again, those major employers with more than 500 employees participated, but majority of our respondents were from that small business owners. Interesting to note, again, 21% say remote work is not possible for their members. So that might be some of our retail members, restaurants, and maybe social services or some kind of service to populations that require there to be in-person capability. But again, 80% have some ability to do remote work to some degree. So if we can go to the next slide. The overall summary, the big takeaways that, obviously hybrid is quickly rising to the top as our new normal to some degree, whether, that's, and I'll get into a little more detail on what we're seeing as requirements or encouragement from some of our members, but most of it is taking form of some hybrid type of workforce. So the second point, respondents reported in-office activity more than the number of days they require. So for example, if an employer requires 2 days of in-office presence a week, they're seeing 3 to 4 days of presence a week, and so on. So, you know, whatever their minimum bar might be, they're seeing more than that in activity. Now, some of that might just be employees spread out. You know, not everybody's coming in on Mondays, but some of them, again, you know, they're just seeing more presence. And then the last bullet point, you know, incentives were not a major draw for updated workplace policies. And so I'll start with that half of it first. So, you know, again, we're not seeing a lot of incentives provided by members who have done some kind of requirement to be back in the office. They just made the policy decision to make that requirement. And they're not seeing, you know, a dramatic increase in turnover related to that. You know, there is a, you know, connection of productivity in that space, but again, they're not seeing a turnover in their employee base. And we can go to the next slide. Again, highlights, you know, many companies that are fully flexible they still have a presence. So, you know, it's going to be, and I'll let Stephanie talk about this in a bit, and I know the other panelists will be, but there's some intentionality around being in the office. And so whether or not they have a requirement to be in the office 3 days a week or 2, if they don't have that, they still are asking employees to come in, but with very intentional purposes that may be, you know, it may be as simple as creating space for their colleagues to engage and get some collaboration, or it just may be the specific issue area might need to have the right people in the room. So intentionality there. In-person work is more common amongst small and medium-sized businesses. We're finding that, you know, the larger employers have more flexibility on that and are able to allow for more flexibility amongst their workforce. And the smaller businesses, again, there may be need for customer facing that is more frequent than with some of the larger employers. And then again, to that point, employees are showing up more than they are required to. So if they are, if there's a 2-day requirement, you're seeing more employees coming in for 3 days. And again, it's starting with that intentionality, and it might be really, and then related to that collaboration. And I think I have one more slide. Sorry, Lee. Yep. And you know, here's some of the numbers. You know. So even if they do offer remote, you know, again, most of these respondents have some presence downtown or in the office, and are again seen that activity kind of grow. Most of our downtown employers do have a requirement, 62% of at least 3 or more days a week, and I think we did the survey right on the cusp of Amazon instituting their 3-day-a-week policy, and we started to see some of our you know, members again start to lean into the space. And to that original point, only a small number of employees have had what we would kind of labeled as that negative reaction, where they've given notice and they plan to leave their position or seek employment elsewhere. So those are the highlights. We released this report 2 weeks ago, and I'm happy to share the link for it, so you can dive into more specific questions and see where some of those trends might be related to, you know, specific days in the office. But I'll leave it there and hand it over to Stephanie. Thank you.
Thanks, Lars. As Richard mentioned earlier, Challenge Seattle is an alliance of 22 of the largest employers in the Puget Sound. We really work on the civic challenges facing our region. And we kicked off this project with 2 key questions among our CEOs. What are the current policies and best practices amongst our members and also in the greater Puget Sound? And what is the role as a business community that we play in the recovery of downtowns, both Bellevue and Seattle? And what are the consequences if we were to embrace permanent remote work? On the data, as Lars mentioned, we found that our employers at Challenge Seattle, as well as the chamber membership, are really embracing both in-person and hybrid, with 91% having those policies instead of a fully remote work policy. And then the consequences are really stark. Half of our economic activity is from downtown Seattle. There's more than 340,000 jobs, and there's some huge government revenue and economic consequences if downtown Seattle continues to only have remote policies amongst our employers. And the next slide, we really wanted to bring together our companies to think about what are these best practices and the how of how to implement. And so our employers, like many of folks on the call today, are really unique. They have different cultures, different workforces, different industries, and also different policies across the board. So we wanted to embrace that, but then really learn from one another about what are these ways that we can better balance in-person and employee experiences. And so for purposes of the playbook, which is available online, but also for the conversation, we really define this as a structured hybrid approach, which means 2 to 4 days a week in the office. And the next slide. Getting a little bit tactical, we really wanted to think about what is the best practice across all of our companies. And it came down to employees must feel that in-office work is intentional, purposeful, and focused. There's a lot of different ways that that can happen. And so our companies came to the table with a lot of different things that they're encouraging employees and managers to do, whether it's team collaboration, client meetings, whether it's project collaboration. There's different stages of the project that to really spark that innovation that companies want people in person. Professional development came up numerous times as a really key way on mentorship and sponsorship that can't be done remotely. And then there's many of the obvious things about across human resources and IT that were lost in the pandemic, and we made a lot of shifts during the remote era, but we can bring some of those things back to in person. And on the next slide, one of these examples that we really thought was empowering managers and really ensuring employees understand the intentional, focused, and purposeful collaboration were team agreements. And Microsoft really innovated this policy. And I'm glad that we'll have Microsoft on the line to talk a little bit more about how they're equipping employees and managers with the agreements. On the next slide. Communications is really a key factor in ensuring that employees and managers understand the why and the intentionality. So in the playbook, you'll find a lot more detailed communications guidance and key messages, which is really a culmination of a company's efforts to engage your workforce, build a plan, create a specific timeline to set expectations, and provide that guidance to managers. I will say one of the biggest points of feedback that we got from our members was really heavily focused on this in-person collaboration. I think that there's no disagreement that that is done so much better in person. People have missed social connections, and a lot of the stories of when people are coming back to the office, they remember, it's many years ago now, but they remember how much it means to see that coworker. I say the water cooler, but in those impromptu conversations. I will also say a great example that we came across in our work was the Redfin CEO's announcement, which was timed earlier this spring too, as we were doing this work that really highlights many of these key messages, and I think serves as a good example of communications. On the next slide, I think another key part of the best practices playbook was how do we make in-office work better while addressing concerns that employees are bringing to the forefront on creating more flexible commutes. This has been the number one barrier from national research of getting people back to the office. None of us want to sit in traffic, either in buses, on trains, or in cars. And to just sit on Zoom the entire time. And so one thing that many of our employers have deployed as a best practice is really being flexible in arrival and departure times to avoid this rush hour congestion. Also, many of our employers are offering commuter benefits and stipends, and there's a lot of innovative things partnering with organizations like Commute Seattle that employers can do. In addition to, I think, really being honest about addressing and understanding some barriers for some employees return to the office, as they've really been able to better balance the work and personal, and that includes things like childcare or dependent care. One theme that we heard is really remembering the pre-pandemic flexibility, those appointments that you have at your home for the plumber, or medical appointments, or traveling, and having that flexibility understood, built into your conversations with both your manager and as a company was really important. That any kind of return to office instructions are not so concise that people feel like they can't have some flexibility still in their lives. In addition to really embracing the professional development opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, and being deliberate with connections with senior leadership, both for mentorship opportunities, but also to feel a better connection with your organization and companies. I will also note that on designing and creating collaborative spaces, hybrid meetings will still exist. And so companies like Remitly, Gensler, Zillow, they've all really rethought their spaces, and I think provide a good model of how to do that. And I know a lot of concerns from employees will come up. And so we really want to encourage folks to think through that hard Q&A and be honest and transparent with employees about some of those questions that may come up. Our goal was really to help create a vibrant and thriving city at the same time, really embracing the benefits of both in-person and hybrid work. So I'm really excited about this project that we were able to do with many of our companies and in partnership with the Chamber, and happy at the end to answer any questions or any advice that we got from our employers, because when done right, we can lead the way as a city and as a region to really have this innovation, collaboration, and be the beacon of the entire country of how to get this right while supporting both our employers and our downtowns. So I'd like to turn it back over to Richard and hear from our panelists.
Thank you, Stephanie and Lars. And I'm so glad that this is being recorded, because I'm really looking forward to looking back on many of those slides as well. I'm thrilled now, though, to introduce our panel. Amy Coleman is Corporate Vice President of Human Resources and Corporate Functions at Microsoft. And Kina Kay, Senior Program Manager, Cross-Cutting Programs at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Kina is part of the HR organization and is specifically on the Business and People Enablement team. Welcome, Kina and Amy. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Richard. Great to be here.
So Amy and Kina, you all represent employers who have implemented return to office policies, and we're going to talk about a few of the lessons learned, best practices you have to share with the group here. Now, a word that both Lars and Stephanie raised, and we see all over the playbook, is intentionality. And I was just chatting with someone about what that word actually means, and like in different contexts, what does intentionality mean in this one? Now, here it means being intentional about how employees are spending time in the office. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means to your organization now and how that may have changed over the course of the pandemic? Amy, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I think, Richard, just like the word unprecedented sort of took on a new meaning of the last 5 years, so has intentionality. I think, we realized when developing our hybrid approach that employees really want to know the why. So we're in a really interesting space since we at Microsoft design a lot of productivity tools. So while we're trying to help our customers be more productive wherever they are, we realized the digital exhaustion, the lack of connection, but at the same time, the gain of autonomy and a bunch of other things that employees really liked about working from home. And we weren't a work from home culture before COVID. So I think we had to be really intentional about the why. And at Microsoft, probably similar to the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we have a lot of engineers. So giving data around the why would you be together? What is it? Why would we believe in that? What's the research on when in person matters? And so I think that's just an example of every spot that we had to be intentional about. What does, being intentional about the definition of flexibility, being intentional about the fact that with our breadth of businesses from Azure to gaming to, different products and services just that cross the globe and cross so many businesses, we also were intentional about giving flexibility at that business leader level. So you can think about your business goals and when in person matters. So I think intentionality has been woven through all of this. And we've certainly found when we weren't intentional and we said, well, we think this is just because we haven't had a lot of success in sort of bringing our employees' sort of hearts and minds along with us.
Thanks, Amy. Kina?
Sure. Our leaders were really clear that there's a belief that in-person collaboration and connections are important to do our work and to the success of our work. And so I agree with Amy on that why being clearly communicated was really important. I think of our intentionality happening in sort of two ways. We've got the foundation as a whole. How are we intentional about the 2,500 of us coming together, and then at the team level? And so the way that manifests is through, we've got director level decisions about we're at 50%. What does that look like for that team? What's the right solution? Is it 50% by week, by days of week? Is it across a month? And so really having that be customized so that it works for the team for what their intentions are and what they're trying to achieve. And then we also look at the foundation as a whole. And I think there's been some really great things that have been done about 4 times a year, having something we call Foundation Week and coming together really intentionally at the division and the organizational level to collaborate, to talk to those that are not just in your team, to be physically present, whether it's in our Seattle office or some of our regional offices. But I think the intentionality is really at the different levels, like what are you trying to achieve day by day, week by week, thinking as a team, but also as an organization. And of course, we're like so small compared to Microsoft. So as an organization, we do think about how we all come together as well in certain points during the year.
Absolutely. Sorry, and I do want to. We do something similar called Expedia Week 4 times a year. Foundation Week, is that what
Yep.
you mentioned? Wonderful. Thanks, Kina. And Kina, you had touched on communication, and I think that's been a challenge for many employers, is how and when and in what manner to communicate a hybrid approach. Take us back, Kina, to when Gates did that. What worked well? What were some of the lessons learned? That you could offer to the team? Sure.
What worked well was lead time, really allowing people to prepare, right? So it was months. We're starting January 17th. We are moving to, that was our date. We are moving to a 50% model, and letting people know that's going to be about that director level decisions. And so that lead time was mostly great. I think there's some ambiguity in that lead time too. So what's my director going to decide? What's it going to mean to me? When is my team going to set our norms? And so I'll contrast what worked really well in terms of lead time with also something I think maybe we would do a little differently in terms of say, it's 3 months till it happens, and we're asking directors to give you at 6 weeks out, maybe a little bit more information because there's a continuum of how planful people are. We've talked about caregiving and different things happening in the home and commuting, right? And so there's, I think, variance in how much people need in terms of that structure and when they know it. So lead time for planning and then the level of specificity that you have during that lead time are both going to be really important.
Appreciate that. Amy. anything
Yeah,
else?
I mean, very similar to what Kina said. I mean, lead time was super critical. Who was communicating it? Sort of that communication from the top, whether that be the CEO and then the business leader. So the division leader, similar to how Kina, I think, referenced the directors. Since there was flexibility at the business level, I think that was important as well. I think the other thing we tried to weave into the communication, Richard, was how much learning we have. I mean, we were just as when we went home, we weren't sure if we were doing this right. So how can we have a growth mindset? How can we prioritize our culture, remind people about our culture, lean on that foundation during this communication? So trying to weave that through was super important. I think when I think about, we also really tried to think about habits. A whole bunch of new habits had been formed during COVID. And so we wanted to give that lead time, like you talked about, and I mentioned, to really form new habits. And how do you think about new habits? I mean, just the habits of, getting up and whatever you used to do, working out, getting your work clothes on, getting in the car, all of those things became new again. And so acknowledging that learning and growth, acknowledging that both in a very serious way and a humorous way, I think really helped us communicate with our employees. I think one of the things that we didn't get necessarily right in that communication is we have 26,000 managers across the globe. We didn't really give them the tools to effectively communicate. We had communication from the top, and then we had, sort of a foundation of our culture and a foundation of our policy, but we didn't really tell them how to go about and do this. So I think that obviously came later, and I'm not sure we could have gotten that all in the communication, but I think that was a miss. And we've spent a lot of time, focusing on our managers since then. So we got the, in a think, feel, do model, I think we got the think and the do really right, but I'm not sure we got the feel just right. Like, how does it feel? What is it going to feel like? So yeah, a lot of learning and growth mindset we've definitely relied on.
I really appreciate the framing, the think, feel, do, and
Yeah.
just the constant calibration of the feel. And I'm not on Expedia's HR people team, so I'm speaking to this as an employee like all others, and sort of an end user for all this communication. And I will say to both of your points, I think I've really appreciated the humility, the empathy, whatever you want to call it, of the communication being explicit about this is a test and learn experiment for all of us, and we are constantly calibrating towards employees, towards business purpose, and be open about how it's going with each other. And I think that's been really meaningful, I think, to our continued progress. And it sounds like at the foundation and Microsoft as well. So we talked a little bit about how the communication to implementation timeline has been important for employees, and how that's taught some lessons. How has it also been important, that transition time, for the organization in terms of site preparation and sort of operational readiness? Amy, why don't we start with you this time?
Yeah, I mean, Richard, you're really testing my memory here. I don't know what happened to my memory over this COVID time and then since then, but yeah, I think we did a lot of communication physically. As odd as that sounds, we're still very much an email and Teams-based company, but you would see a lot of communication acknowledging the change, like, we're getting ready for you. Having, sort of our digital team internally. So think about our IT team, as we generally call it, like how to get everybody ready to come back, how to make it easy for employees. So reducing the friction for employees on everything in employee experience. And I don't know about, but it's been so important to think about employee experience in the physical space too. And that's been more of something in HR that I haven't really, not being in sort of a company that deals with physical space issues, like maybe more core manufacturing or something like that. I haven't had to really think about a physical space being part of the core employee experience. But I think as we readied for employees to come back, understanding their expectations, understanding what a difference physical space can mean to that experience. So looking at our from the cafes to the IT to, I know this sounds ridiculous, but helping employees like reconnect to printers was a humongous deal. And so really kind of looking at all of those dimensions of, collaborate, if we're planning for onsite to be about collaboration and connection, how do you make more spaces like that? One of the things we really focused on is our conference rooms. We are a meeting-based culture. And so we know hybrid meetings are here to stay. And to be honest, we weren't great at them before. So working in, making sure our hybrid conference rooms are noted as hybrid, because we have a lot of transitioning to do across our campuses, to make it so that it makes it, again, really friction-free, that the second somebody walks in the room, there's something that understands that there's a physical presence in the room, and the lights come on and it automatically connects to Teams. Audio and video is friction-free, whiteboards and things like that. So the cameras, there's just been a lot of technology that I don't think we focus on as much internally as we've had to really ready the organization. But we've learned a lot as we've gone through it.
Thanks, Amy. Kina, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So connecting to printers, it's real. We have that too. I will say similarly, we've been a lot of technology changes, project rooms that are interactive with interactive whiteboards. Obviously, we're big users of all the Microsoft, products and Teams, and so everybody's gotten really comfortable. But it is a pivot now to get really comfortable again now in a hybrid space, right? So when we were all on sort of level playing field with everybody on Teams. And so I think one thing I'm thinking a lot about and want to make sure we continue learning from, unintended positive consequence of that time was that we heard that there was a more inclusive experience for some of our people in other regions and remote individuals, right? Because everybody was on Teams and that was the same. So now that we're back in the office, how do we maintain that? And so I'm looking forward to, this is somewhat off of your specific question, but I think in that growth mindset, continuous improvement, we're looking forward to seeing our annual employee survey. What do we hear about how hybrid is working? And I think one of the things I'm anticipating, so we're going to need to also look at the physical space and technology, and how do we ensure that if we have lost any of what we gained in terms of inclusiveness with everybody being in a digital space, how do we now learn more about how to be partially virtual, partially physical, and maintain that inclusive experience where we saw that people felt they were participating more, they felt more included. And the other thing I would just mention, as well as, it's also all of your, for us, it was our food services and our space people and all of them as well, getting ready for everybody to come back. And it's going to be a little bumpy because you don't know how many people are going to come on what days. And, it turns out for us, we have some days that we see a lot of participation versus not. And I know that has been challenging for some of our vendors and partners to sort of watch as the organization gets into more of a steady state and they know how to service us and what to expect along the way. So I think letting everybody know that might be a little bit bumpy as you go.
Thanks, Kina. I appreciate you calling out there's the work infrastructure, and then there's also just the human infrastructure of being back in the office. And certainly at Expedia, we've gone through it's Expedia week. We have to wildly goose our recycling and garbage takeouts, and are there enough microwaves, and what does the line at the badge entrance look like, and all of those sort of just elements of being human in a space together without a lot of predictability to number. And so speaking of that humanity, some of the biggest barriers for a lot of employees, for I think everyone on this call, is demands at home, whether that's as a parent, a caregiver. How do you make sure that employees can manage those responsibilities like school or childcare, dependent care, medical appointments, all of the things, while returning to a hybrid approach at the office? Kina.
Sure. We have always had some of that flexibility. We've been fortunate in that way. And so that's been maintained or carried through. I think the other part is looking back at sort of the hybrid model and that team level decision making. And so individuals have an opportunity to say, this is the day, like we have early Wednesdays. I don't know about anybody else. They're out at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, right? And so like, that's not going to be the perfect day for me to do in person. And I have that flexibility to change to pick which days I'm there. And so we had that flexibility to some extent before, but in some ways, because we've really learned how to be effective in a virtual environment, there's almost more flexibility. I don't know that I would have been just assuming I'd be the one at home every Wednesday before. And now, because I know everybody will know how to engage with me and they have the technology to do it, I know that that's me. I'm here, 120 dismissal. And so we've maintained that. And I would say even increased it because we all know how to be flexible and be on virtual. And again, making those decisions within teams. So we've been really fortunate that that's kind of always been our culture. And I'd say it's even more so now. There's a high level of trust that people know how to work from wherever they are. Amy, is that similar to what you're experiencing?
Yeah, I'm nodding here, Kina, because it's so true. I mean, flexibility was a core part it's a core part of what we provide in our mission and purpose is how you can be anywhere and be connected. And so, but like you, Kina, we weren't actually that specific about it. So I think talking about flexibility in different dimensions, we talk about it in work site, work hours, and work location. And so I think giving people the language to say what they need, and then and really understanding also that the world, like you said, Richard, it's changed. I mean, childcare and things like that have gotten way harder than they were before. Just the stability of it and the access to it and the labor market. And so acknowledging the world has changed, giving more language. And the one thing that I continue to have to remind myself is flexibility is so individual. It's very life stage related. It's very individual to what is important to me, what I value. So there isn't a one size fits all. So it's really about equipping people to have a conversation, like you said, about what is it that you need? Is it Wednesdays? Is it, coming in later because of your commute? What is it that you need? And getting managers and employees or employees in place to kind of talk about that. I think it's really important. The other thing, and I know the Gates Foundation does this a ton, is we tried to address some of the world changing upstream. Like, how can we help? What is the issues that people are struggling with, childcare and tutoring and school hours? And is there something that we can fund to help a barrier that we can remove just of the company size and the platform that we have to help them out? So we really kind of also at the same time assessed our benefits to see what were some of the gaps in childcare and helping kids with, some of the mental health challenges that have come up, some of the schooling and tutoring and learning challenges that have come up. So how can we not only address with flexibility, but help with the upstream, with the community, and with what our employees, really listening to our employees and hearing what they need.
That's excellent. And I will shout out both the Chamber and Challenge Seattle for being very forward about a lot of those upstream issues as well, and trying to I think, in addition to intentionality and purpose and focus, we'll add flexibility to sort of the core principles of the approach. Before we go on, I do want to remind folks, or a couple shout outs. One, in the chat, there are links to survey results as well as the playbook itself. And also, please do feel free. We have no audience questions. Which means either everyone's got this figured out or you're just a little shy in the Q&A. So assuming the latter, please feel welcome to throw our panelists and Stephanie and Lars some questions in the Q&A. But you did mention, I think both of you, flexibility in hours and location. Commute has always been an issue for us as a region. I think we're all eyes wide open to that. How, if at all, did your return to office policy, or do you at Gates and Microsoft accommodate the barrier that is commute for your employees? Kina, why don't we start with you again?
Sure. As I said before, we were flexible, I think even more so now, right? So we haven't ever been a 9 to 5 kind of everybody's here at this time. The expectation has always been be available for the meetings you need to be in. And I think the difference probably now is, and if you need to take that one virtually to avoid sitting on Mercer, for a long period of time, then that works. I do think, Richard, goes back to the, like, this idea of trust is huge now. Like, to people need to, I believe, feel seen and recognized for all the good work that they did while we were all 100% virtual. And so that message of flexible commute, you know how to get your job done. We already know that, right? And so you also know how to make the decisions about when is the best time for you to get here when you need to be here. How do you best engage? I think trust on all of that's going to go really far in terms of people also being seen for what they were accomplishing under unprecedented circumstances in the past. So we're really flexible. We have reinvigorated. One thing I will add is, like, people sort of, van pools died, right? You know, to some extent, right? So, like, reminding people, like, here's all the ways you can get to work. So I have seen some stuff from our transportation folks kind of breathing life back into some of that, in terms of, like, we just did yesterday was bike to work, you know, or alternative commute day and things like that, to also habits. We mentioned that earlier, get people back into some of those habits.
Thanks, Kina. Amy, anything to add on the commute piece?
I just a +1 to everything she said. I think trust, communication, reminding of habits. You know, we haven't been an attendance-based company. That's probably, it's not exactly hitting the right mark with that language, but we weren't, you know, we weren't checking in when you got in, and we weren't checking when you left. Although people kind of, there were norms around that. So I think what I've seen change, Kina, maybe you've seen the same thing, or maybe I'm speaking of myself. It's like, I used to tell everybody when I was leaving early or when I had an appointment. Now people don't do that anymore, but it does feel a little bit uncomfortable at first. But I trust that if you need to leave and you're going to be on your calls or hybrid, it truly doesn't matter to me, as long as you're doing impactful work and we're meeting our business goals. And so I do think there's a lot of that in there. The commute, we have some natural commute times that we always saw heavy traffic, you know, sort of on that 520 corridor. But I think invigorating the ways, the connector, the different ways to get to work, and just reminding people about that, I think has been super important.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think our, you know, Expedia built a commute program, I will say, largely modeled after the great work done at the Gates Foundation. And, you know, I think we didn't make a lot of changes to that program before and after we all got sent home for the pandemic, but that has been an important element. I think to the extent we see in the survey results that incentives themselves are not a huge push on return to office rates. We do offer incentives around multimodal or van pool or you know, our shuttles, our employee shuttles, a daily cash incentive. And that's actually helped bring people, that commute incentive has helped bring people back to the office by virtue of that's where the shuttle goes. Awesome. Thanks for those of you who are putting some questions in the chat. I have one more of my own, which is maybe we can start with Amy, because it's a little bit about that team agreements slide that Stephanie shared with us. So one of the best practices that we've heard is around the role of managers to ensure that in-office time is used intentionally and is meaningful and is effective. Can you talk a little bit more about those team agreements and other ways that you all have and others can empower managers to guide this return?
Yeah.
Amy?
I think, and thanks for highlighting that, Richard. And as Stephanie put, I saw some of the resources that she pulled, and you know, it's a pretty simple concept at the core, Richard, is to really give managers and employees a way to talk about this, and you know, sort of grounded in our culture. And so there's so much diversity in job, in background and experiences, and as I said, in needs around flexibility. So, and there's a business we need to run. And so the flexibility needs can be very individual, and then the business can be very much us and team. And so how do you bring those things together in a conversation? And it became, you know, Stephanie, I think we'll share that. I think it's in the playbook or share it out. But what it ended up being is really having a manager set the context for the team, which is really around collaboration. So bringing the team together, restarting what that team meant, and what your purpose was as a team and who you were, and really looking at hybrid as an opportunity. I think, you know, we're in a once in a Gates Foundation, Keena probably knows better than I do, but sort of the once in 100-year change in how we work. And so how do you embrace that with optimism and say, okay, what new skills are we going to learn? And what are the new opportunities? So really kind of getting to know each other. When we rolled this out, kind of talking about how the last few years were, and then consider the business and the team priorities that you have. And then in those team agreements, there's really a reflection exercise. So it gives an opportunity to talk about flexibility and the dimensions of availability, communications, meetings, collaboration, and information. So what that means is it gives some structure to my expectations as a manager. Okay, maybe I say, okay, Keena, the first Monday of every month, the whole team is going to meet in person. For those of us that are co-located. And yes, for XY, we're going to do something different and we'll do that hybrid. Or maybe going back to your guys' weeks, that would be part of your team agreements. Or maybe one of your team agreements, like Keena said earlier, is because we found a lot of inclusion upside with going all virtual. Maybe we're very intentional that people are virtual. And no matter what, for whatever event that is. So it gives an opportunity. How are we going to communicate as a team? Is it going to be a Teams channel? Is it going to be email? How are we going to talk about meetings? What is schedule and flexibility and global meetings and what times they are? So it gave some dimension to having all those agreements, even being able to have the permission or the ask in to say, like, what are your focus times? What time do you need to be offline? And how as a manager can enable that? So it really gave language and a bit of a change management in a really simple way, Richard, an approach to how do we talk about this stuff as a team? And then how do we be transparent? So Keena knows what I need. I know what Keena needs, and we can do the best that we can within that structure. It was, and the resources are public. So it's been really a great way to, sort of enable hybrid. The other things you talk about is like information. How are you going to store it? There's not that idea, like I can walk by and say, hey, can you hand me that PowerPoint that you used to? So how are you going to store information? So some really basic stuff, but it was, I think, really empowering, and also give managers a way to have the conversation. I don't know if that helps, Richard. No, I'm doing a lot of hand.
I think it does. Yes. No, I mean, I think all of this is incredibly helpful. And yeah, I think adding a little bit of specificity, not only just empowering managers, but how to empower managers and how to equip folks to be, I think everything that we've talked about is sort of operationalized by the kind of work that you just discussed, Amy. Keena, anything to add to that before we move on to a couple audience questions?
I think that some of what Amy was describing and then seeing that is kind of that piece I said we were missing a little bit of, right? Between like saying 3 months and we're back, and would that have been a great exercise for teams to work on that 6 weeks out, or to start working on, so that people had a little bit more clarity. So yeah, sure. I'm looking forward to spending some more time looking at that myself.
Likewise. Well, being mindful of time, we are at 7 minutes till the end of this. I have a couple questions from our audience and want to invite Stephanie and Lars also, if the spirit catches you, to feel free and jump in as well. Why don't we start with a question from Katie, who asks, childcare and elder care are very challenging. My window's a little bit, very challenging and individual. What strategies are you pursuing regarding childcare and elder care? And I know Amy and Keena, we talked a little bit about those at-home barriers and how we accommodate through flexibility and trust as employers, human lives into work life. Stephanie, Lars, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add to that from the playbook and from the survey.
Well, I'm actually a new mom and have a 7-month-old at home. So I feel like I am the person who is really dealing with this challenge. And I do think, I know some of our companies are the larger companies, but they've really thought this through both pre-pandemic and into this time period of thinking about on-site options, thinking about the flexibility and commute times. And I know Microsoft does offer a backup care option to employees. I believe, Amy, you may know more of the logistics of it. And I actually thought that was a really innovative way to think about, even if you're on wait lists for a year, like I was, to get childcare, that there are these other options and backup services that employers have embraced for their employees.
Thanks, Stephanie. And in 5 minutes, one more question from Jill for everybody. Thoughts on companies making showing up in person part of performance reviews? Come in for the scariest meeting of the quarter. Come on.
I'm happy to jump in on some of the things that we found with our work group. This was a key question on the accountability and transparency. There's been a lot of news on this one. And I will say the work group, this is an evolving issue and it's evolving best practice. And I don't think that anyone had the right answer of this is what you do. But I do think you've seen some companies, even just this past week, I believe Google announced that. But I do think as we had the conversation about, for example, team agreements as a really positive way to think about if an employee is willfully violating a team agreement, then it's likely not the only issue at hand. So really treating this as between an issue between an employee and a manager. I would also note, I thought an interesting finding from the chamber survey was that very, very few employers are having negative employee reactions. I know I was surprised by the number in the survey in the context of that's what we see in the headlines and on the front page of the paper. But in reality, if the announcements and the work is intentional, focused, and meaningful, employees are bracing coming back and having those in-person collaborations.
Yeah, I would just add, I'm gonna kind of flip it and move away from the the accountability side and talk about the benefit side. We had 41% of respondents just talked about having in-person meetings as being really helpful to spark that collaboration and really develop teams. So building up the team was a theme we saw in that space. And I don't have this number in front of me, but the opportunity for mentorship and for career development, that number was also of note. So it wasn't in the top 5, but again, I think it offers that availability to career development.
Thanks for shouting that out, Lars, because I think that's, there's work and then there's the career stuff that happens between bouts of work at the office, right? There's the casual question and the conversation you can have that isn't scheduled on your calendar that I think means so much to all of us. So with that, we're at almost time. Welcome anyone to say a quick last word. Otherwise, I'll wrap this up.
I'd like to share that we do have what we call a RLC in Action event coming up in 2 weeks. That is continuing this conversation on return to office. That meeting is going to be a little bit more about why it's important for people to be back in the office, and especially with the economic development and vitality of a place like downtown where there's significant impacts to having more people here. The public safety discussion as well, that is very critical, and we know that many employees care deeply about. So I hope you can all join us for that as well. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, with that, we are at time. Thank you so much, Amy, Keena, Stephanie, Lars, also to our fantastic chamber staff, Lee and Shoshana, for pulling this together, and most of all for everyone in the attendee list for joining us this afternoon almost. So wonderful to see you. We'll see you back at the office. Foundation Week coming up at Gates. We'll all come by. Otherwise, have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Keena.
Thank you.